when you're not speaking. And we would suggest for non-speakers maybe to keep your video off to maintain a good quality of connection until the point it may be when you would want to get the floor. Please be aware that there is English-Russian translation. So in the lower right part of the lower navigation bar, you find the interpretation button, and you'll be able to switch to Russian in case that would be your preferred language. And the chat is enabled, and therefore we look forward to seeing your comments and your questions in the context of the discussion. The side event will run for 1.5 hours. We'll have 2 different panels, and we'll try as much as possible to maintain some quality time for discussion. So first and foremost, let me invite all speakers to really be short and sharp in their contribution so that we can ensure that we have some good time for discussion. 3 super quick introductory notes on my side. First of all, whenever we discuss the follow-up and review process, it's very important to recognize that we are a little bit lost in some sort of a narrative bubble, you know, in which we spend a lot of time to perfect the discourse, very often with various degree of political correctness, with lots of qualifications on what we mean by development, sustainable, inclusive, equitable, and all these sort of things. But in this narrative bubble, we tend to be very distant from reality, very distant sometimes from the real preoccupation of many of our social groups and our constituencies, particularly because this narrative bubble tends to be very distant for clear, actionable implementation initiatives. Secondly, this narrative bubble increasingly takes place in some sort of theatrical multilateralism. It's a multilateralism where we don't take decisions. And if we take decisions, those decisions are yet again narrative decisions. And this is a major difference from where we started with the sequence of UN major conferences. If you go back to Rio, we are still negotiating and advancing the normative process of the 3 main conventions that came out of Rio. So you could see the strong impact in normative developments to which civil society very strongly participated to. But this seems to be gone somehow, you know, into a phase in which we're trapped into that narrative with very theatrical, choreographical form, where civil society sometimes, rather than being a substantive player that brings in the perspectives of right older groups and many societal constituencies, is sometimes seen as an element of folklore, sometimes even of moderate criticism, in a context in which yet no actionable focus tends to lack. So we seem to have initiated a process which I define a little bit of a theatrical form of development policy entertainment. And lastly, when we locate this in the context of the ECE region, we sometimes forget the extreme heterogeneous nature of the region, with some countries that are part of this mechanism, which are at the core of the political economies that continue to dominate the global economy and also global governance and decision-making mechanisms, and others that very often do not clearly fit neither in the north-south discourse, and maybe not even in the developing sort of taxonomy. And there are these sort of differences and heterogeneous nature in the context of this theatrical multilateralism and narrative bubble sometimes are not yet being recomposed. So I think these are 3 elements that it's important to consider when we discuss some of these issues in the particular context of the ECE region. So let me now dive straight into the first panel. We have 3 fantastic speakers. The first one is very well known to all of you. David Nabarro is the Special Envoy to the WHO Director General on COVID-19, explaining all his roles, past and present, will take the entire session and more, but I'm sure you know him well. He is not in the best speaking conditions today, and I therefore understand that he also has a backup. Catherine Deland from WHO will be here in case his connection becomes unstable and may be able to fill from him in case he is not able to contribute adequately. After David, to him we'll immediately give the floor, we have also two additional speakers which will complement the first panel. The first one is Alanna Armitage, Regional Director of UNFPA for the Eastern Europe and Central Asia region. And then Carlos Berrospe Garcia, Head of Sector for SDG implementation of the Directorate General for International Partnerships of the European Commission. So we'll hear from them, and then we'll see what kind of debate this springs out of their initial intervention. So without further ado, David, if your connection allows, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefano. I hope I'm audible and that you will tell me very quickly if for any reason it doesn't work. As you can tell, I've had to move rather suddenly to go and do something, and I was planning to be with somebody else in the vehicle, but that hasn't worked today. My colleague Catherine Galland is here. I really enjoyed your introduction. I liked your heading number 2, the theatrical approach to development policy. I want that to be my starting point. And it's going to be a relatively short presentation based on my roles in COVID-19 and my roles in the preparation for the Food Systems Summit. It goes like this. Yes, in the last few years, there is, I think, a role being played by civil society in relation to development policy that is a bit of theatre. It's as though the civil society has a kind of part in the process that leads to phenomena like those you described. But I want to really concentrate on the COVID-19 issue and what that has shown us, and use that as my basic argument to everybody that a different role for civil society is emerging. It's emerging incredibly fast, and I think it requires some attention. So COVID-19 has appeared, and efforts to deal with it as a public health issue have been, I think, quite remarkable, and there's been huge progress. I believe that COVID-19 could easily have had much, much worse consequences in the last 18 months had it not been for really effective action in the health sector in many countries, together with a lot of efforts by multiple actors. But here's the issue with COVID-19. It is fundamentally a problem and challenge of inequity. It is a disease issue which is demonstrating what we've known for a long time, but we just need to be reminded of often, and that is that when it comes to ill health, people who are poor tend to fare much, much worse than those who are better off, and sometimes the gradients associated with poverty are really extreme. So with COVID, we have seen in the totality of the global situation that whether you are in the United States or in Western Europe, in Africa or Asia or Latin America, that if you are poor, and in particular if you are income poor and in my view also rights poor, your COVID experience is going to be much, much worse than if you are well off. We particularly see it in the US with the greater disparity, people who belong to ethnic minorities having measurably much higher rates of extreme sickness and death. We've seen it in Western Europe, and with COVID experience that is for poor communities and poor individuals than it is for those who are better off. I don't need to explain why. Now, the consequence of this has been that responding to COVID has required an awful lot of governments. It's required...
Государству
when actions affected more than half the world in about September, October 2020. The consequence of that was that poorer people were particularly likely to have a whole mix of adverse impact, but particularly the problem of difficulty of accessing food. So the reaction to this was, in many countries, let us ask for the NGOs
David, I'm not sure if you can hear us, but we seem to have been encountering some connection issue right now, so we kind of lost you. Let's see if the connection resumes. I think we lost David. Let me just give him a minute to see if he connects back straight away. If not, I think we move on with the program.
Thank you, Stefano.
Okay.
What I'd really like to do is to hand over neatly to Catherine Deland rather than have it done by necessity. So Catherine and I have been working on the reality that the COVID situation led to a massive request for civil society to act, but really extraordinarily limited amounts of cash, quite bizarrely small. In Britain, it's been particularly bad because at the same time as asking for civil society to help, the British cut their development assistance rather dramatically. We've also seen the same phenomenon in relation to preparation for the Food Systems Summit in September this year, but there the problem's been particularly challenging because, as well as depending on civil society for the preparation for the Food System Summit, we also managed to create a situation which provoked a boycott by quite a lot of civil society. So on the Food System Summit, it's not been the lack of cash, it's been that the boycott has happened. With the COVID problem, it's lack of cash. Either way, what I would like Catherine now to pick up on, and I would like to stimulate discussion on from the rest of you, is civil society is so badly needed, and for a mix of reasons, the establishment on various sides is not necessarily creating the welcome environment. Stefano, thank you for the chance to be with you. Sorry for the poor connection. Now I pull out and I will disconnect, but I hope that I can continue engaging with all of you involved in this HLPF moment, because in my view, never has there been a greater need for civil society in all parts of the world, in the rich world as well as in the poorer world, because right now that need is extreme, and COVID has shown us we have the need, but also all the food system work as well. Thanks again, and I pull out now. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, David. Always a pleasure to interact with you. And let's say to complete this, I would maybe ask Catherine if she is connected to see if she wants to complement what David mentioned with any additional consideration at this stage. Catherine, over to you.
Thanks so much. No, as you know, David is an absolutely unparalleled speaker. So I will leave it with him for the moment, but I look forward to being here and to engaging in the group discussion later. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much and for being with us here. Let me then move to the second speaker. Alanna, over to you. Please, floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Stefano, and good afternoon from Istanbul to everyone online. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this dialogue during the HLPF, which I think is so important. And as David has just said, really shining the spotlight on the role of civil society in confronting the pandemic and catching up for the SDGs. I think whether in the economic, social, or environmental dimensions of sustainable development, we've been hearing a lot in the past week about how the COVID-19 pandemic has undermined years and years of development efforts in all the SDG areas. The UNECE region, of course, is no exception. And I believe that has been well articulated in the UNECE regional report. I think also that the draft HLPF ministerial declaration, from my reading, captures the key impacts of COVID-19 in our region and the calls to action, including on the social pillar, which I know is a focus of what we're talking about today. But what remains to be discussed, and Stefano, you raised this very articulately, is really moving beyond the call to action on what needs to be done and actually doing it. And from what I've seen in the past year and a half, the role of civil society has been fundamental. And certainly from the perspective of UNFPA, civil society has been a key partner in confronting the pandemic and really providing services to those most vulnerable. So from the perspective of a UN regional office, one that supports the work that we do on the ground through our country offices, I'm seeing a lot of action. And a lot of it is together with civil society, and I'll get to that in a minute. What I did want to respond to are some of the key questions that you've asked, some very concrete questions, starting with the key actions that need to be taken to ensure a greater focus on the social pillar. Well, I think just looking at some of the statistics in terms of what's happened in our region, overwhelmed health systems, resulting in significant disruption to essential services. Just as an example, we've seen in Central Asia, for example, a really significant increase in maternal mortality during the pandemic. We undertook a rapid assessment in Central Asia, which showed that cases of maternal death have increased across the region in 2020 compared to 2017 and 2019 averages. In Kyrgyzstan, maternal mortality ratio increased by 25%, and the number of maternal deaths increased in Tajikistan by 40% and Uzbekistan by 42%. That's really huge. Again, among some of the most heartbreaking statistics was what we consider to be the avoidable death of so many older people during this crisis. It was the direct result of our failure as societies, institutions, and cultures to assign equal importance and value to the lives and well-being of our older generation. And at the other end of the spectrum, young people have been very hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic and do face the real possibility of becoming a lost lockdown generation, impacted over their lifetime in terms of education, income, and hold on the labor market. And young people are telling us how stress, anxiety, depression, or other trauma during isolation is really impacting on them. Unfortunately, mental health still remains a taboo in many of our countries, and this definitely needs to change. COVID-19 has had a huge impact on women and girls, disrupting the interventions to reduce gender-based violence, including earlier forced marriages, as poverty really is a key driver of this harmful practice, which is more prevalent in our region than we think. There's also been an increased burden of care for women, either within the home or in health and social systems. So with all this evidence, we know that one of the longer term impacts of COVID-19 may actually be the restoration of traditional unequal gender systems and norms. So how we think about gender in our response really can't be an afterthought, and we do need to build back equal, as is being said. I think the pandemic has also shone light on individual and collective vulnerability, and we've seen how social inequalities are reproduced in a structure that only recognizes certain vulnerabilities and hides others. And that's really, I guess, the central point that David was making as well, and why we are here today. COVID has had a terrible economic impact, there's no doubt, but ultimately, its impact is embedded in our social norms, our social life. So it's exacerbated pre-existing inequalities, challenges and risks. And it is rolling back the gains made in the past decades on gender equality and deepening pre-existing inequalities. So to your other question on the role and responsibility of the UN and its member agencies like UNFPA to support actions within the social pillar, I think that the UN has played a fundamental role in calling attention to marginalized groups to improve their lives. And we've been working with member states to support them to protect the health and well-being of the most marginalized groups in the region. Just as an example, I spoke earlier about the devastating impact of COVID-19 on older persons in our region, and UNFPA together with UNECE, OHCHR, WHO, and HelpAge International actually very quickly established a joint program on aging called Building Forward Better in Light of COVID-19, upholding the rights and dignity of older persons through health, social care, and enabling environments. And we are working very closely with UN country teams to develop their joint action plans to confront the pandemic, to provide emergency response, but also look at long-term issues of changing the narrative around ageism and the rights of older persons. So I think also beyond the work of individual agencies and working collectively together, we do have the UNECE Regional Collaborative Platform, which offers an important fora for having the conversation needed, but also through its issue-based coalitions, which are groups of UN agencies coming together to sharpen the focus on inequalities. We're working really to support civil society on the ground. During the most recent UNECE Regional Forum in March, with the support of what's called the Issue-Based Coalition on Youth, which is chaired by UNICEF and UNFPA, we helped ensure that young people were speaking in 8 out of the 12 roundtables that were organized during the regional forum. And we organized a dedicated roundtable on young people as part of the regional forum itself for the first time. So I think that's an important role that the UN has in fostering participation and voice. And finally, to the question on the role of civil society to support SDG implementation, I think that question has already been answered just by the very organization of this meeting. I think that civil society seems to be more visible during this HLPF, and it certainly was in the regional forums leading up to this, even if virtually. But civil society has to be fully integrated into implementation and recognized for their involvement, as was just being said earlier. Civil society has had I don't even have the words to express the word. I mean, critical, crucial, important role in responding to the pandemic and providing services and support to communities to tackle the effects of COVID-19. So really, that question is fundamental. I would end, I guess, just by saying that, the pandemic has created an opportunity for some of us to try to reset the dial and build a more equal world for all. I think that we will never achieve that, of course, without the strong civil society engagement and investment in the work of civil society. So as we journey through the decade of action, the voice and role of civil society in addressing the impact of COVID-19 is fundamental. I wanted to end with a very short video of a few highlights of our work over the past year and a half, not because I want to show what UNFPA specifically is doing, but because a lot of it has been done with civil society. And it's just, I think, a good reminder of some of the issues that we face. So Aziza, if you don't mind, I would ask you to put that short video on now. Thank you, Stefano.
Thank you so much, Alanna, and thanks for the very powerful video. I'm going to give the floor to Carlos, but before I do that, I'm going to pose a question to you and possibly to Catherine as well. I'll let you ponder over it, and maybe we'll get back after Carlos' intervention, something that just did spring out of some of your interventions. I mean, you do recognize that social tension it has been rising. You know, the political economies which are at the core of the current form of somehow hegemonic and homogenizing globalization are very strong. And those are also very closely embedded within patriarchal structures that you've also been referring to. And in this respect, the level of social tension and sometimes the confrontational approach that civil society has been trying to take to confront some of these dynamics and the call for systemic reforms is increasingly high. Now, I had the opportunity of engaging during the phase of the conferences of the 80s, and there was a level of affinity and complicity between civil society and UN agencies that sometimes I have the feeling is lost. And again, I'm not speaking to any of the two of you particularly because we don't work together. So hopefully you won't take this sort of personally. But we are increasingly sometimes in a situation in which we do have friends within the UN agencies, but overall, there's a lot of agencies, and again, it's difficult maybe to have this conversation in generic terms, which try to somehow domesticate sort of civil society's confrontational approach, sometimes through cherry picking, sometimes to try to, you know, look more at the center rather than the fringes, and tends to be a little bit more protective of maybe governmental positions, and sometimes even in manners that may also be justified by the complexities of their own governance structure. So I understand it's not an easy answer, but I have the impression that there was a little bit of a magic, if you allow me that, in the way in which we worked, sometimes informally, sometimes in corridors, sometimes, you know, behind the theater, in the series of UN conferences of the 80s, and the way in which we work today. And I'm wondering whether you have any reflection on that, which you may want to share with this group. I'll leave you with that, and which of course you can agree and disagree with, obviously. But in the meantime, let me invite Carlos to take the floor. As I mentioned earlier, Carlos is the head of sector for SDG implementation of the Directorate General for International Partnerships of the European Commission. Carlos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefano, and thanks for the organizers. It's a pleasure to take part at this event with civil society. In fact, I've been in a number of meetings with a number of civil society recently, and for me, it's always a pleasure. I will focus today, because we're speaking about the decade of action and the SDG implementation. I will give a focus today on what we're doing at EU level to implement the SDGs, because maybe it's not sufficiently known and we want to show what we're doing, also to align what we're doing. And this, of course, then leads to how we are adjusting our actions in the context of COVID, but I leave that more for the discussion that follows, and the role of civil society. But I would like to focus on a number of general points that maybe are less known and I think are important to be understood, about how the Commission as a whole is now each time more strongly supporting the SDG integration in what we do at EU level in general and in the external side. That is the main focus of my presentation. So I will share the screen. If it works, you let me know. I'm waiting for some message from you saying that everything is okay. Yes?
Yes, thanks. We can see it properly.
Okay, so thanks again. So the first thing is that with the appointment of President von der Leyen in her political guidelines for the College of the Commission, which is now exercising its responsibilities still for a few years, she made clear she wanted to refocus what is called the European semester to integrate the Sustainable Development Goals. What is a European semester? is the process of macroeconomic and social and increasingly environmental coordination, including debt considerations and a whole range of policies, and to put this long-term vision of sustainability as part of it. This is very important because, as you know, the recovery and resilience reaction to COVID has been completely integrated with this semester process in one single strand. So basically, it means we're putting the SDGs at the core of the recovery, including the next generation EU recovery package. But this was anticipated by putting the SDGs at the core of the socioeconomic engine of the EU. Then when it came to each commissioner got their own mission letter, and one paragraph you could find in all of them was that you should, Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Vice President, ensure the delivery of the SDGs in your respective area, while the College of Commissioners, therefore the President, keeps the collective responsibility. For instance, in the case of my Commissioner Urpilainen for International Partnerships, she also had a specific bullet about ensuring that external financial action promotes the SDGs. So basically, the indications were at the highest political level from the beginning. When it came to the main priorities that are being pushed by the Commission and more broadly now by the EU across, the Green Deal, the first communication that put the Green Deal on the table already said that it's an integral part of the Commission strategy to implement the SDGs and bringing back the issue of the semester. But this important document said that so the SDGs are at the heart of policy making. And this has been seen in a number of areas. I had a little more on the semester, but I will not engage, but it is supported by the Eurostat annual report on SDGs. What is interesting is that in this semester process, we start to look with the same indicators of Eurostat, which are very related to the UN indicators, but also at member state level. So we are helping the mainstreaming, even though the member states themselves are doing a tremendous job, of course. And then the work of the Commission every year, there's a key document called the Commission Work Program that says the top list of priorities every year. And I wanted to mention the very first work program that sets the whole mandate said our compass will be the SDGs. They will guide our work across all sectors in internal and external action at home and at abroad. And they announced a document with an approach to the governance on governance to the SDGs. So this document that was announced was adopted at the end of last year. By the way, this presentation will be made available. You don't need to take notes. It contains hyperlinks. This document is called Delivering on the SDGs, a Comprehensive Approach. And it included a number of messages that I wanted to highlight a selection. The first thing is that it made a strong link between the priorities of the Commission. Maybe you don't see it from there, but it's the Green Deal, an economy that works for the people, a digital, European way of life, European democracy, with the SDGs. Of course, it's not a closed list, given the interlinkages. By the way, in the field of international partnerships, we have responded, as the second graph you see, with the similar priorities, and again, starting with objectives, the SDGs. So it was clear that we will not proceed to some priorities unrelated to the SDGs. It's our manner to respond to the SDGs, and through them, we will pursue the SDGs together with our priorities. Just to take an example, this comes from the Central Service of the European Commission, the Secretary General. They explained the European Green Deal, which, as I mentioned, is an integral part of the Commission strategy, and they want to promote the SDGs through the different initiatives. What is also important in this document is a clear commitment to something we have been pushing forward at the UN level, which is policy coherence for sustainable development, and the whole of government approach, which, by the way, is not only whole of government, it's whole of society, because when we bring in the stakeholders and civil society, the private sector. This is a sort of graph with the main areas of action where actually you see the second one in orange says engagement of civil society and other stakeholders. But basically, it's a range of policies we are pushing forward to take further the SDGs, the semester that I mentioned, the multi-annual framework and the next generation EU that I mentioned, monitoring, reporting, and a very important one I want to dwell on called better regulation. I will come in a minute to this. Because I work on international partnerships, I wanted to mention that this guiding document also says a number of things on what we do externally, aligning our design of our functions, our reporting, and in the context of the COVID-19 recovery, we push building back better in a manner that is aligned as much as we can with the SDGs, of course, in dialogue with partner countries, through an approach called the Team Europe, which involves the EU, the member states, and the European Development banks. And the president of the Commission calls for a global recovery initiative to link the investment, the debt relief, and the SDGs. Because basically, we're going now through a massive period of investment and debt, and we cannot afford to do it wrong. We have to do something that already anticipates future crises and mitigates those risks by inserting sustainability and resilience in what we do. I will say a couple of things more about this better regulation, because that's basically very good news. Better regulation, what is this? It's a series of legislation inside the European Commission about how to make directives, how to make European regulations. How do you do an impact assessment? How you make a legislative approach, proposal. And one of the major changes a couple of months ago, there was a communication to update this. And one of the main messages, actually there were like three main messages at the beginning and the end, is to mainstream the SDGs to ensure that every legislative proposals contribute to the SDGs, combining with the do no harm principle of the Green Deal. And then it explains that every proposal has to look from the impact assessment stage to the relation with the SDGs. I think it's very important to see that the cover page of this communication showed the SDGs with this creative picture with a calculator for 2050, so looking beyond. And just for you to know, we are now working on taking this further, and there is a new so-called tool. The better regulation has a number of tools which explains how the SDGs have to be monitored in the impact assessment stage and in the proposal. I wanted to say a couple of things on the external side, but I will not expand much. We already adopted the so-called European Consensus on Development some years ago, which was a shared effort negotiated with the member states and the parliament. So it's not just a Commission product. It's really signed by the presidents of the three institutions, and it's our decision that development cooperation policy, which also applies in the neighborhood, I mean, the principles where we are taking further, is a shared commitment of EU institutions and member states to support partner countries to implement the SDGs. So it's structured by as the 2030 Agenda Preamble on People, Planet, Prosperity, Peace and Partnerships. It has a number of features that we could discuss, but many of them relate to what we're saying, including working with stakeholders, focusing on results, policy coherence, thinking beyond ODA and all this. I just wanted, I'm getting close to an end. We just adopted recently the new multi-annual framework, which is a regulation with a budget behind, that we will apply for development cooperation and neighborhood policy. So this instrument was adopted very recently. It's called the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument and Global Europe. And in the initial article on the objectives, you can see that one of the objectives is to contribute to multilateralism and to the achievement of the commitments agreed to, notably the SDGs, the 2030 Agenda, and also the Paris Agreement. So it comes really up front. Now we are taking this further. We are, as we speak, preparing the programs for each country, starting from the neighborhood, the colleagues of DG NEAR, but also beyond in Africa, everywhere we have partnerships. And we are preparing these multi-annual plans, in which one of the functions we do is to integrate to which SDGs each program will work. So basically what we do, we try to represent it as, this is my Director General, International Partnerships, or INPA. What we try to do is to integrate, as I said, what we do, the SDGs, to show it well through reporting that shows the SDGs. I'll show you an example. With this, we gain the credibility that we're doing our task. We go to the global level, like now to the HLPF, to show what the EU is doing. And that allows us to go at this overarching level at the European Commission, as I explained, with the president, to try to influence the policies we do with a better regulation. And this comes back to our external action, etc. So we are one of the engines that makes the machine flow. And one of the things we're doing, for instance, is adjusting our reporting so we can show what we do by SDGs. It's very complex because we're very committed to show the interlinkages, but we don't want to have double counting. So we are trying that each project has one main SDG and other SDGs, so we can see all the wealth of our actions, but at the same time, we manage to present what we do. So I did not engage in much details of our actions with the civil society. Of course, their function is fundamental. You know, we have framework partnership agreements with many of you in the field of development cooperation, and of course, in a range of areas like environmental policy. The role of taking further the SDGs in partnership with the governments at all levels and civil society is central. And I will be ready in the exchange to engage more in what we are doing in relation to SDGs and COVID. I did not mention, for instance, that through the Team Europe, we have put together 40 billion euros, including a 3 billion contribution to COVAX to share vaccines worldwide. And all of this is being made in a manner that pursues as better as we can the SDGs in our actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And in fact, if you, Alanna, and Catherine allows me, I'm going to give the floor to our 3 civil society speakers so that we hear their perspectives. But before I do that, I'm also going to leave for equity considerations a question for you to think about when we get to the debate. I think the push for the European Union to really take a regulatory approach is obviously very much appreciated. I think it also refers to some of my sort of opening interventions. However, the level of regulations are both internal as well as somehow global, no? And some of those global levels require a number of systemic reforms that are able also to provide the fiscal and policy space to all countries to really engage on their development trajectories. And in that respect, the EU has a little bit of a how can we say, an approach to multilateralism, which is very selective in terms of what it wants to discuss in the UN context and what it wants to discuss within, you know, some of maybe developed country clubs, such as the OECD. You know, a lot of big narrative issues, certainly the EU has been quite an important player in facilitating the discussion over this at global level within the UN. But when it comes to taking key decisions on systemic reforms, particularly in economic frameworks, it kind of retrenches within the OECD. And this is somehow creates a challenge in some respect in a multilateralism that can set aspirations, but can also take decisions on how to realize those aspirations, to the extent that those decisions are constantly taken away from the multilateral space for discussions within only developed countries organization. So I'm going to leave you with that challenging question for later to stimulate the discussion. But now let me, without further ado, hear a little bit how different civil society organizations and networks really want to highlight issues faced by people and social groups that are often marginalized by this sort of mainstream development process and discourse. Let me start with Marie-Luise Abshagen, Head of Sustainability Policies of the German NGO Forum on Environment and Development. Marie-Luise, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Can you, Carlos, please stop screen sharing?
Apologies.
Okay, thank you for the invitation and giving me the floor and share the perspective of German civil society. I would like to begin highlighting the situation of some marginalized groups in Germany, especially in the COVID pandemic, and then elaborate on how this links to the 2020 German VNR. So the group I would like to focus on is people affected by working poverty. As a matter of fact, this is a huge issue in German society. The percentage of people that are permanently affected by poverty has doubled since 1998 due to specific social policies since then. And one of the most striking aspects of poverty in Germany is the high amount of working poor. So 21% of those in dependent employment work in the low wage sector in Germany, which is actually the biggest low wage sector in the EU. This is also because there's a big disparity between the low wage threshold and the minimum wage. Minimum wage was introduced in Germany in 2015, but it did not decrease the proportion of low wage employees, because the minimum wage in Germany is now €9.60, and the low wage threshold, which is defined as less than 2/3 of the median gross pay, is around €11. So still a big disparity. As in many other countries, COVID has especially affected people with low incomes. We have already heard this in the other presentations. And while saying this, I think on the one hand, it has to be said that the German government has tried to support people in the crisis by, for instance, supporting companies with systematic short-time pay compensation payments, meaning that the government supported companies in paying the salaries of around 60% so that people can stay employed even though production might have stopped in various sectors. However, 60% is of course not much if your income is already very low. So despite these and other efforts of the government to support people, companies and employees in the crisis, this did not solve the underlying problem of the high degree of working poor. And I think this is important to stress that even though COVID has, of course, increased a lot of problems, many of the issues were there before, and we were not on the right path to achieve the SDGs even before the pandemic. So on the contrary, we will see, I think, the scope of the low income sector and the effects of people working but still in poverty in the coming years, as in many countries as well. To give you one example where multiple forms of marginalization and discrimination come into play, I would like to focus on one group in particular, which is migrant workers in agriculture. So the working conditions of migrant workers in seasonal agriculture work, such as asparagus or strawberry harvest, as well as in the meat industry, have been a topic of debate for many years, but with the pandemic have become an issue of national debate, so to speak. You probably know Germany has a really big industrial agriculture sector, and many German farms are highly dependent on low-wage workers, which are often seasonal workers from Eastern Europe. And during the pandemic, even in the spring of 2020, during the first lockdown, seasonal workers from Eastern Europe were flown into the country without proper care or support in order to prevent COVID infections. And in fact, a lot of people did catch COVID. Also in 2020, COVID infections turned out to be especially high in areas with meat industry, which is because the workers they're living in these compounds and their working conditions did not cater to the proper distancing measures necessary to stop the spread of the virus. So as a matter of fact, these cases made public the living conditions of migrant workers, especially in the agriculture system, as well as their hard and low-paying working conditions. And as I said, all of this had been there before COVID, but yeah, let's say under the cover of public disinterest, maybe. Unfortunately, little has changed since then, and as the industry claims, these were only individual cases, and the link between certain influential politicians and the agriculture system is, yeah, let's say, friendly to a rather problematic degree. Now coming to the German VNR, this does not really reflect in the report at all. On the contrary, the report states that with the introduction of minimum wage, the conditions of people working in low income sector has noticeably improved. This of course is true in a way, but only in the sense that it was worse before the minimum wage, which does not mean that conditions are good now. And seasonal workers, for instance, despite this being, as I said, a major topic in the public debate in the last 1 year at least, they're not mentioned in the report at all. This is unfortunately not surprising for the VNR or the German sustainability strategy for that matter, which is the basis for the German VNR. And we as civil society have voiced our concern with the strategy for quite a while now, as it often does not properly analyze the structural problems in German policies, nor does it really provide strategic ideas on how to solve them. But it is more or less a collection of a description of different policy areas and the measures different ministries are taking. To close up, I think right now we have a bit of a good and a bad condition to change all that. As this is an election year in Germany, there's of course a window of opportunity to talk about these different levels of inequality in Germany. This of course includes the impact German policies have on the rest of the world, only to name the blocking of the vaccine waiver by the German government, which is truly enraging. Unfortunately, so far, social and economic inequalities have not been a major topic in election campaigns, but we'll see how it goes until September. For sure, I can say election year is not a good year for VNRs, as there's little interest by politicians in the VNR, in Germany at least, because everybody is involved in their campaigns, and there was little room to include positions in the VNR that move beyond what has been agreed by the government in the last year. But as I said, every election, I think, also gives the opportunity for policy change. So one thing looking forward is something I like to present that we as the forum did, which is to focus on concrete legislative proposals for the next government to implement in the coming years. We have just published a study which includes about 100 proposals for new laws, which we structured along the SDGs.
Sorry, Marie-Luise, if you could wrap up kindly, because
I am. Just to mention this, because I think, contrary to what's mentioned by the Commission, I think this better regulation is actually a huge problem, because among other things, it often leads to less regulation for companies, and what we actually need is more legislation. So to wrap up, this is a proposal we have set, because when we enter this decade of action, what we need is actually a decade of binding commitments. So not more strategies, but actually real action with real consequences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie-Luise. Let me now give the floor to Maria Mourtzaki, Policy Manager of ActionAid LS. Maria, the floor is yours.
Maria, we can't hear you. Your mic is off.
Oh, excuse me. I was saying that we would like to thank you for the invitation today. It's really great to have the space to talk about the issues that we are working on. So I will try to be as brief as possible, because I know that we don't have much time. I would like today to raise some issues regarding how the VNRs could be a tool for safeguarding the rights of refugees and migrants. So to start with, we need to have in mind that Greece has published its latest voluntary national report for SDGs in 2018. Since then, we don't have any progress report on SDGs. So we are like in the dark about what's happening in terms of the progress made so far. This report set forth a number of commitments that the Greek state had said that it's going to have regarding the realization of SDGs, focusing on the immediate need to reduce inequalities that seem to have widened due to the economic crisis that the country faced in the recent past, and from which, to be honest, it had not recovered by the time of the publishing of the report. So the process of monitoring and evaluating national policies in Greece has always been an issue of discussions among policy professionals and people who work in the field, because policies in different fields seem to change according to what is actually happening, and it's not following a strategic vision that responds to what the needs are. So it seems that we first do, and then we try to make legal, let's say, or introduce in laws what we have already done. This is very, very important, and this is actually what is happening in the field of protecting refugee and migrant rights. During the pandemic, we know that many steps have been taken back in terms of safeguarding refugee and migrant rights, because we noticed and we have reported as civil society quite many violations, such as limited access to public health services for refugees and migrants. This was the case in the past as well, but it seemed to have been like intensified during the pandemic. And it's not only public health services, it's also about other vital services in the country for refugees and migrants. We have seen people living in overpopulated sites on the islands, mainly. And we have also seen that refugees and migrants have been accused by the media and by some of the government officials for being responsible for spreading the coronavirus because they could not take all the precautions. So we had this kind of narratives in the public discourse that made the situation a bit worse than we expected. These violations have been reported by civil society, of course, and by other relevant networks, but we also saw limitations to civil society as well, with the aim of exercising control, and relevant complaints have been raised by civil society to international organizations. At the same time, we saw many new laws and policies being introduced without civil society being able to properly participate in the public consultation processes due to the limited time that we have in our disposal. And as you understand this in this context, there is complete lack of policy coherence, something that is vital for the realization of SDGs. I'm trying just to provide some bullets to give you a picture about what is happening in the country right now. We know that currently we have quite many strategies. For example, we have an integration strategy for refugees and migrants under consultation. However, the civil society has not been part of this discussion yet, despite the fact that we've been constantly asking from the government to participate in these discussions, to have a picture of what is happening and how we can actively contribute in that process. So many challenges that existed in the past seem to have been intensified in that context. Of course, people's lives have been hugely affected. And we know that we are in the process now of being prepared about the next day. The pandemic should have changed the way that we think and subsequently the way that we cooperate and the way that we need to act from now on. So if we need to ask for something and address some recommendations to the Greek government and of course to any other person that is in charge of adopting policies and strategies, we would like to ask for intersectional and inclusive policies that will seriously take into consideration actual needs instead of trying to build theoretical constructions that have very little impact on people's lives. Of course, we need, as it was said by Marie-Luise before, we need specific measures with timelines of implementation, with monitoring and evaluation mechanisms, and not just narratives. We've seen that many governments, the Greek government being one of those adopting this kind of approaches, have tried to use communication tools to introduce to the public and present to the public measures that have been taken, but actually it's more like adopting communication strategies instead of addressing actual needs in the field. So I think that we can use the tools such as VNRs to monitor the progress that is made and figure out what the next steps are. However, we're not very optimistic about that. We need to fix many things to make sure that the civil society is going to be properly consulted and participate in an equal way in this kind of consultations. But we try to be part of these networks and the works that are taking place to ensure that the protection of the rights of the people that we are working with will be ensured. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria. Let me now give the floor to our last intervention, and then I think we'll revert back to Alanna, Carlos, and Catherine if she wants to engage for some reactions on these different intersectional comments by civil society, as well as, if you like, some of the questions that I earlier posed to you. But certainly primarily do these interventions. And then, of course, I'll ask the same to Maria, to Marie-Luise, and of course, our last speaker, who is Ezel, Buse, Sonmezocak, apologies if I may have mispronounced your name, of the Women for Women's Human Rights, New Ways. Ezel, floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for the organization and inviting me. Good afternoon, everyone from Istanbul. I'm going to speak on achieving the SDGs in the face of anti-gender movements. So as you may know, Turkey submitted its VNR reports twice, first in 2016 and then 2019. In the alternative report that we feminists prepared in 2019, we emphasized that even though Turkey's last report presents a promising outlook, there were some alarming and really worrisome backsteps and political statements regarding gender equality, which makes it impossible to reach goal 5 and the other targets related to women and girls. While in written documents and reports such as the development plan or action plans, Turkey presents very well pictures. They mention SDGs and their significance for enhancing gender equality, but yet at the same time, constantly and systematically attacks gender equality and women's human rights. Indeed, in the last VNR, Turkey was seen very proud of having the Istanbul Convention, for example. From the state reports, I quote, in the context of preventing abuse and violence against women, Turkey was the first country to sign and ratify the Istanbul Convention, they said. While seems like very proud of being the first country to sign the convention in international reports and platforms, in fact, Turkey, became the first state to declare its intention to withdraw from the convention. Frankly, it was really shocking that such unconstitutional presidential decision was issued without consulting or even informing the public or even the ministers, given the fact that the Minister of Family had organized a side event at the session 65 of CSW and hosted the Council of Europe Director of Human Dignity and Equality. And they talked about the effective enforcement of the Istanbul Convention and the coordination between the Council and Turkey. This event was just 3 days before the decision was announced. And as you may have heard, the reason for the withdrawal was that the Istanbul Convention was hijacked by a group of people attempting to normalize homosexuality, which is incompatible with Turkey's family and social values. Such statements and developments incline us to question the steps, of course, Turkey argues to take on gender equality in its VNR, as well as Turkey's statements and commitments in its other international reports and platforms. For example, in the last report, one of the policies that Turkey announced to implement in the upcoming years to achieve SDG 5 was, quote again, mainstreaming activities and studies for raising awareness to prevent all forms of violence against women, they said. But in practice, what happened in practice? The Council of Higher Education, for example, canceled their projects on gender equality, claiming that gender is not compatible with Turkish moral system. So this hypocrisy is, of course, not unique to Turkey. We see the Turkey's withdrawal attempt is the culmination of global attacks against human rights in general and gender equality and LGBTI plus rights in particular. We know these attacks by authoritarian populist governments have a global spillover effect. They learn from each other, right? Turkey announced its attempt to withdraw targeting LGBTI plus manifested with hate speech and arguing to the convention is not suitable for Turkish family. We very well know this rhetoric often employed by anti-gender movements. We see this in Russia, in Poland, and recently in Hungary. Such assaults weaken and undermine multilateralism and states' accountability under international law. So it is not only women's and LGBTI rights, but also gender equality, human rights, and democratic principles are at stake. Because human rights are inseparable in itself. They are intersectional and closely linked with each other. That's why we believe that achieving the SDGs in the face of anti-gender movements could be only possible as long as we make sure the SDG goals are connected with and supported by the international human rights mechanism as much as possible. And we know that the 2030 agenda is firmly rooted in the international human rights framework. Implementation of the SDGs is expected to be consistent with international human rights. And international human rights framework and SDGs, therefore, are inseparably linked one another. When I use the term human rights, I do not refer some abstract ethical claims, but I refer to a legal system in a positivist way, because we see that populist governments see and use human rights as it's somehow common good or somehow like ethical choices, but nothing more. So not obligatory. So something cannot trigger, international accountability. That's why we feminists in Turkey use mainly the human rights law discourse when we apply to the Supreme Court against the withdrawal decision. Because if you don't make this linkage visible, this inseparability, then anti-democratic and populist groups and movements easily can change the meanings of the terms of the rights. For example, they can declare they will adopt a family-based development model, as Turkey did in the last VNR, or they can declare that right to life covers fetus, so then easily attack to sexual health rights, or they can withdraw from a very fundamental human rights convention by claiming that it has a somehow hidden agenda. The hypocrisy that I mentioned in the beginning is tried to be presented as local and structural. However, the authoritarian governments or populist and anti-democratic movements do not simply just occur and choose to govern oppressively. So now we have to ask the question, and this is probably my question for the discussion session. I know it's a little bit provocative, but still, are we going to keep on naming and shaming when we are already losing our most fundamental human rights? Or are we going to start to think more international and more powerful international mechanisms backed by international human rights law in a positivist way? If our answer is going to be the second one, then I guess we have to reimagine the human rights system, not as a system which is fully fragmented, fully bureaucratical, and fully abandoned to the experts who presents well-sounded reports and commitments in international arenas and platforms, like just like Turkey did, but a system which is universal, inseparable in itself, and intersectional. Always talks with one another, always backed and linked with one another, and so always protected by one another. So not a system which see human rights as a bargaining chips, but a system taking rights seriously. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ezel. Thank you very much for this very powerful reflections and considerations. Let me get back, because we only have 15 minutes left. So I'm going to go back to Alanna first, and then also Catherine and Carlos. There are also some questions in the chat box. There is one particular that maybe the speakers on the chat on the session here may not be able to address, which is the one with respect to CSO access to the New York headquarters. I guess because of you're not directly engaged in New York, but rather in Istanbul and Geneva, maybe we'll leave that question off. But I think the comment is valid in terms of sometimes being felt by civil society that we are somehow treated as the general public rather than an integral part of the UN family. But let me get back. Alanna, over to you first, and then I'll follow with Catherine and with Carlos. And then I'll also invite, I will not inflict you any final consideration on my side, but rather ask Ezel, Marie-Luise, and Maria to maybe also provide the last final 1-minute comment before we wrap up. Alanna, over to you.
Well, thank you, Stefano. And I really appreciated the civil society interventions that we've just heard. And I think, you know, whether we're looking at the services that are being provided to communities on the ground or the advocacy that's taking place around language, semantics, and human rights, the role of civil society is fundamental. And I want to get back to the question that you asked, which is, have we lost the level of affinity and complicity that we enjoyed in the 1980s and 1990s during the decade of UN conferences? And of course, we did enjoy, I think, a very strong partnership at that time. Conferences like Beijing, Cairo, et cetera, achieved the outcomes they did because of the advocacy and the work of civil society together with the United Nations and member states. So I don't think we've lost the affinity. I think as Ezel just very eloquently put forth, we're operating in a completely different world. One where both civil society and the UN are confronting rising illiberalism, a crisis of democracy and the rule of law, and even questioning the legitimacy of multilateralism. So in that context of increased polarization, the UN is then being called upon to play a brokering role as it attempts to uphold human rights. And I think what, you know, I certainly don't have the answer. It's a daily struggle for an organization like United Nations Population Fund, whose mandate is to help countries achieve universal access to sexual and reproductive health and rights and gender equality. So it's something that we deal with and grapple with ourselves. What I do know is that we have to continue the dialogue. We have to engage with those who may not agree with us. We need to make sure that civil society is also inclusive in terms of those that we're engaging with. Having said that, we are here to uphold human rights. And in that sense, we absolutely must partner even more with civil society that is promoting reproductive rights, human rights, gender equality, but also defending human rights defenders. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, if there's no one left to defend the rights that we all believe in, the world will be a very sad place. So I think, as I've explained earlier, UNFPA works very closely with civil society, as do many other organizations in the UN system. I think the regional UN system offers a good platform for civil society engagement, and that's improving, and that's all thanks to the great champions that are here online with us today. So I think, you know, that complicity is there. We wouldn't run many of the programs that we run if it weren't for the advocacy of civil society around older people, Help Age, the NGO Committee on Aging, and so many other issues, disability, refugees, etc. So it's there, but we need to continue to work closely together, and the UN will continue to play an important role in supporting civil society.
Thank you so much, Alanna. Very much appreciated. Catherine, over to you. Would you like to step in with your own considerations?
Sure. I think maybe just to be super short. First, thank you to everybody for the incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking interventions. We're also lucky to have opportunities like this. And I know David probably said this better than I will, but I will say, you know, I think maybe the COVID has given us both an opportunity to reset in some ways and kind of reevaluate, but it also has reminded us of things that we've known for an awfully long time. And one of the things that we've known for a long time is that communities are at the heart of good health, of good economics, of human rights, of, you know, good education. That's where it lives. It lives in communities. It lives in families. And certainly no outbreak response that I've ever been part of, I'm a public health person, has ever been successful without deep, profound, and committed community engagement. And whether that comes directly with community leaders or with civil society, both, all of it, it's about building trust. It's about working together. You mentioned at the very beginning, Stefano, your super challenging question about sort of the dynamic that we're in now with social tensions rising, the current political economies, and that there seemed to be this kind of halcyon past of NGO-UN relations. I certainly experienced that in the tobacco control community when we were negotiating the tobacco control treaty. There was a real sense of love and support in lots of ways. I mean, there was also conflict because, I mean, there's a role that NGOs or the CSO play, which is, you know, to balance some of the government and to speak to those things. I think it's really important. But I'm reluctant to have a moment in time where I say things were better before, things are terrible now. I don't know if that's true. And I think that it feels like things are challenging now for lots of reasons. I mean, you know, most of us have been locked in our houses for months and months. I probably, you know, don't want to even see my family again for a while, but you know, like things are challenging all around and for lots of different reasons because we've been in this really challenging year. But I am so reluctant to say that things are worse now than they ever have been. I really see this as an opportunity. And I think the places that you see that are successful with COVID, the places that are really changing the way that they think about moving forward and what kind of, you know, not building back better, but building forward better. I sort of hate the back part because I don't want to go back. I would like to go forward. But you know, I think as we build forward better, we do, like, why not build bridges instead of being sort of upset that we aren't where we were 20 years ago. You know, let's do it. I mean, it just takes all of us being committed to it to make it happen.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Very appreciated as well. Carlos, over to you, and then the final round of our civil society speakers.
Okay, Stefano, I will reply to your question, but also to a point made by Marie-Luise about the regulation. And I hope I will say interesting things that are not often heard. One of them is your point on multilateralism and the EU, whether we are selective and not always go to the UN, but to other places. Well, first, the EU is extremely committed to multilateralism because we are an international organization. And in that multilateralism, we always say the UN is at its core. For us, is a fundamental partner. But it doesn't mean that multilateralism is not a toolbox. It's a toolbox in which sometimes how broad it is can be an impediment to agree on specific items. I'm going to give you two quick examples. One of them, when we were involved in the SDGs, already in Rio+20 action, we had the difficulty to negotiate inefficient fuel subsidies. You all think it's useful to have a target in 12C about that. It was very difficult to negotiate. Actually, it was among the worst. In Rio+20, it led to reservations by a pack of countries. We managed to do this because we had agreed in Pittsburgh in the G20 language on this. And that allowed us to partner with Saudi Arabia and Iran, believe it or not, to find the target 12C. And even though we did that, we had to give concessions to the ALBA countries supported by Venezuela, and we had to add in accordance with national circumstances. So just to tell you, the difficulty of the UN, depending on the subject, can be very complex, and sometimes you can get shortcuts in other areas which finally can come back to the UN. Another example, we speak today of VNRs. Do you think that's the language we wanted to achieve? Reviews? We didn't want reviews. Do you think we wanted the V, voluntary? No. It's not easy to agree always what you want at the UN immediately. Sometimes it takes time. The VNRs are developing wonderfully well. And by the way, the EU, we plan to do one in 2023, which could be also an occasion to engage with civil society, incidentally. But we wanted to have a reporting system of peer review accountability, and we didn't make it. By contrast, for instance, in the OECD, in the context of the donors, we have agreed on reporting guidelines on how to report on SDGs, and that work, we hope, will bring back later common ground to the UN context. So basically, you have to be playing with different cards of your package to obtain different things, and that's what we try to do, always aiming at the broadest scope, which is the UN. And on better regulation, to Marie-Luise, a couple of things. The first is that what I was saying today is not judging whether better regulation leads to more or less legislation, as you are saying, more regulation. The point, actually what I'm telling you today is not even agreed. I'm telling you what I'm working now. By the end of the month, hopefully, or by next summer, you go to the Better Regulation page and you will find the sort of things I'm telling you. There will be a new tool on SDGs above all the impacts, environmental, gender, everything. There will be a sort of SDG consideration. The SDG indicators will be integrated in every single impact table. So what I'm saying, we're going thoroughly through it. If you give me 1 minute to share screen, I'm going to share for the first time something which is absolutely experimental. We try to help the whole commission to identify, because now everybody in DG Transport, Energy, Fisheries, they will have to say how their actions contribute to SDGs. Do they know about SDGs? So we are working with the Joint Research Center. I'm going to give you a quick scoop of something I'm working right now, which
I think you can you can share screen, but please, Carlos, be very quick because we have 4 minutes left.
But you are going to like it.
Good.
It is an electronic recognition tool of how a draft legislation, for instance, contributes to the SDGs. So basically now I'm doing it for development cooperation. I'm going through the different programs. So just to show you how, if I put, for instance, an instrument like the new instrument that I showed you, the machine will assess what are the relevant SDGs and can easily give an indicative indication of to which SDGs the draft, in this case, is a final contributes or can contribute even at a target level. So why I'm showing you this? Because this tool will be integrated in the Better Regulation I told you. By the way, eventually we will make it open to stakeholders, but it's not yet public, but it will. The point is we try to have the tools, we try to design the tools that will help people across the whole commission to really integrate the SDGs in their thinking and their policy making. And that's what I was saying. If we achieve this change, which is nearly agreed now in Better Regulation, the whole legislative initiatives of the EU will be SDG directed. And that, I think that's a very important message I wanted you to keep. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Extremely interesting, and looking forward to see more of this within the public domain. Let me give now, we have 3 minutes left. I'm going to give 1 minute of final pitch to our 3 civil society speakers in a reverse order. So we start with Ezel. Ezel, over to you. Your final pitch for 1 minute.
I didn't expect to start. All right. Yeah, I was listening, and I think I have no words to add, but I just want to say we now started an international campaign with all around the world from the feminists, and it's titled United for Istanbul Convention. So join us, support our intersectional movements. And I think that's it that I can say for now, because we all know the attacks, the anti-gender attacks are similar, is getting similar day by day, and so we think that the struggle must be similar and united. So that's why we started that kind of international campaign. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Ezel, and thanks for your contribution. Maria, over to you. Final pitch.
During the speeches, I was thinking that we live in a quite complex time, and that's the difference with previous years, that we have many issues to deal with, and there is complexity that we need to understand in order to advance the way that we work. And we don't have the luxury of time. I mean that sometimes we are not interactive enough, and we need to, sometimes I know that we need more time to design and implement and discuss, but things are not going to wait for us to happen. So we need to be like more proactive and try to understand in a better way this kind of complexity. And one last message I would like to share is that progress is a dynamic process and is always a continuum. It's never enough, and we should not take anything for granted while we're trying to move forward. So this this was the thing that I would like to share for closing. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Maria. And then the last but not least, Marie-Luise, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, Carlos, I will probably contact you afterwards to continue this interesting discussion. But for the closing words, first, I think it's important that we remember the SDGs were not on track before the pandemic, so we shouldn't get derailed by how much worse it got, but really keep pushing. And on that, the second point, I mean, listening to HLPF for now all these years, you really get depressed afterwards because people describe how bad things are, and then on the other hand, we see all these great solutions, but policy change does not come. So I think for this decade of action, it is really now time to do something, and I direct this to the UN representatives and the Commission representative, and of course governments as well, because I think it is not necessarily the job of civil society to implement the SDGs, but it is a governmental task, and we need to push governments to actually implement the SDGs for real.
Thank you so much, Marie-Luise. We are 1 minute beyond session, and the HLPF session is starting. So let me simply thank all the speakers, all the organizers, and all those that attended the session. The discussion continues, but overall, it seems to me that one message is very clear. We need to move beyond narrative discussions, and we need to move concretely towards binding commitment in terms of laws, programs, policies, systemic reforms, institutional reorganizations, and re-architecture. We need to move beyond the words and really move into actionable, concrete outcomes. That's where civil society is pushing, where civil society is working, and that's certainly what we are primarily concerned with. We'll continue the discussion, but let me thank once again all of you, and looking forward to seeing and crossing paths with you in other sessions and HLPF. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye. And have a great rest of the day and the week. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Stefano. Thank you, everybody. Thank all the organizers, and thanks also to our wonderful translator.
Thank you so much. Do you want a photo, Sasha?
Yes. Where do you Photo taken. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming, everyone. Bye. Bye-bye.